A disabled veteran bent down to grab a box of cereal. That's all. He wore an old ball cap, one boot newer than the other, a Marine Corps sticker on his cane. He didn't speak much, just nodded at the cashier, moved slow, tried not to be noticed. But someone noticed. A younger man, loud, restless, looking for someone to shove. He muttered something about old cripples under his breath, then swung. Dropped the veteran on the tile like he meant nothing. Said, "He was in my way," and started walking toward the exit. What he didn't know was whose father that man was, or what kind of Marines were stationed just 20 miles down the road, or how fast a unit can mobilize when the message isn't official. It's personal. Want to know exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. These stories matter more than most people realize. Now, let's get into it. Harold Brenner moved through the world like a man who'd learned to carry weight without making noise about it. At 68, his left leg didn't bend quite right anymore, hadn't since that IED outside Ramadi took a chunk of bone and left him with a titanium rod that ached when storms rolled in. The blast had killed 2 Marines in the Humvee behind him, boys barely old enough to shave, and Harold still woke some nights hearing their voices calling for their mothers. But he didn't complain about the leg. Never had. Physical pain was just weather, something that passed through you if you didn't fight it too hard. He'd learned that in the field hospitals, watching kids half his age refuse morphine because they wanted to stay sharp, stay ready, just gripped his black aluminum cane a little tighter on the bad days and kept walking the way Marines do. That Tuesday morning, the automatic doors at Thomas and Riley's Market whooshed open with their familiar sigh, releasing a breath of cool air that carried the scent of fresh bread and floor wax. Harold liked coming early, before the aisles filled with rushing mothers and crying babies. 7:15 was perfect. Quiet. The way he preferred most things these days. He grabbed a red plastic basket from the stack near the entrance, the metal handles cool against his weathered palm. His shopping list was simple, written in careful block letters on the back of an envelope. Milk, bread, bananas, coffee. Nothing fancy, nothing that required reaching too high or bending too low. He'd learned to shop like he'd learned to walk again after the blast, methodically, without unnecessary risk. The produce section hummed with the quiet buzz of mist sprayers, keeping the vegetables fresh. Harold paused at the banana display, his fingers testing the firmness of a small bunch. Not too green, not too spotted. Just right. As he placed them gently in his basket, Lisa from the deli counter waved from behind the glass case where she was arranging potato salad. "Morning, Mr. B," she called softly, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that came from seeing the same faces every week for 3 years. "You need me to grab anything from the top shelf today?" Harold shook his head with a small smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "If I could clear a 3-story building in Fallujah with a busted ankle, I reckon I can handle the cereal aisle." She laughed, the sound echoing off the refrigerated cases. "Roger that." The easy banter felt good. Normal. Harold had never been one to wear his service like a badge. No Marine Corps cap, no Semper Fi decals on his pickup truck. But the way he carried himself, the way his eyes still swept rooms before he entered them, the precise way he folded his receipt and tucked it into his shirt pocket, it was all still there. 24 years of muscle memory doesn't just disappear because you hang up the uniform. He made his way slowly down aisle 4, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the polished linoleum. The sound echoed slightly in the high-ceiling space, mixing with the distant hum of freezer units and the soft rock station playing from overhead speakers. He paused in front of the oatmeal section, studying the boxes with the same careful attention he'd once given to supply manifests and ammunition counts. That's when the rhythm broke. Heavy footsteps, impatient breathing, the rustle of someone moving too fast through a space meant for taking your time. "You gonna stand there all day, Gramps?" Harold turned slowly. The voice belonged to a man maybe 40 years old, thick through the shoulders with arms covered in jagged tattoos that looked like they'd been done in someone's garage. His hoodie was stretched tight, across a gym-built frame, and his jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. There was a restlessness in his eyes, the kind Harold had seen before in men who'd never learned to be still with themselves. Derek Slade. Harold that didn't know his name, but he knew the type. The kind of man who'd been laid off from the plant 6 months ago, whose wife had taken the kids and moved back to her mother's, whose unemployment was running out, and whose anger needed somewhere to land. Harold had seen plenty of broken men in his time, and he recognized the signs, the way Slade's hands clenched and unclenched, the slight tremor of someone who'd been drinking earlier than most people had their first cup of coffee, the desperate aggression of a man trying to feel powerful in a world that had stripped him of everything that once made him feel strong. Harold stepped aside without a word, making space. No point in starting something that didn't need starting, but the gesture seemed to irritate Slade more than blocking him would have. "What's with the gimp stick?" Slade sneered, eyeing the cane. "That from falling off your rocking chair?" Harold kept his voice level, the way he'd been trained to do when dealing with civilians who thought volume equaled authority. Something like that. But his calm dignity only seemed to stoke the fire. Slade moved closer, his voice dropping to a mock whisper that still carried down the empty aisle. "You know what I think? I think old guys like you milk this hero bullshit. Walk around slow, make everybody feel sorry for you. Act like the world owes you something just 'cause you were too dumb to avoid the draft." Harold's grip tightened slightly on his cane, but his face remained neutral. He'd heard worse from better men. "If you say so." The dismissal was too much. Without warning, Slade's shoulder slammed into Harold's chest as he pushed past, a deliberate collision that sent the older man stumbling backward. Harold's cane clattered against the shelving, and his basket hit the floor with a metallic crash that sent bananas rolling across the linoleum. "Watch where you're standing," Slade muttered, not even turning around. Harold steadied himself against the shelf, breathing carefully through his nose. His ribs ached where Slade's shoulder had connected, but he said nothing, just reached down slowly to collect his scattered groceries, his movements deliberate, despite the pain. But as he bent to retrieve a banana that had rolled under the bottom shelf, Slade turned back. "You know what? Forget this." The punch came fast and low, a sharp jab aimed at Harold's kidney as he was half-crouched reaching for his fruit. The impact folded him like a broken lawn chair, sending him crashing into the cereal display. Boxes of Cheerios and Lucky Charms cascaded around him as he hit the floor hard, his cane spinning away across the polished tiles. For a heartbeat, the store was silent, except for the distant muzak and the hum of refrigeration units. Then a woman's voice shattered the quiet. "Oh my God, he hit him!" Mrs. Patterson from the bakery section dropped her shopping basket, plastic containers of cookies spilling across the floor as she rushed toward the commotion. Behind her, Kevin the stock boy rounded the corner at a run, his work apron flapping. Slade stood over Harold's crumpled form, chest rising and falling, like he'd just finished a workout. "Shouldn't have been in my way." Harold lay on his side against the base of the cereal display, one hand pressed to his ribs where the punch had landed. His face was tight with pain, but he didn't cry out, didn't make a sound, just breathed carefully, the way medics had taught him in field hospitals a lifetime ago. Lisa arrived first, dropping to her knees beside him without hesitation. "Mr. Brenner, can you hear me?" Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she reached for his wrist to check his pulse. Kevin was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling 911. "Don't bother," Slade said, turning to leave. "Old man's fine, just being dramatic." That's when Carl Henderson stepped into his path. Carl worked at the steel mill until they shut it down, then drove truck for 20 years until his back gave out. He was 62 now, still broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd grabbed hot metal more than once. He positioned himself between Slade and the exit, not saying a word. "Move," Slade said. Carl didn't move. "I said move, old man, or you'll be down there with him." Carl's weathered face remained expressionless. "No." Behind him, other customers were gathering. A young mother with a toddler in her cart, her face pale as she instinctively moved to shield her child's view. She'd never seen violence up close, not real violence. And her hands shook as she gripped the cart handle, an off-duty cop still in his civilian clothes, his training warring with his off-duty status. calculating whether he had authority here and whether these people needed protection, or if they were providing it themselves. The FedEx driver, who always stopped in for coffee on his Tuesday route, a Vietnam vet named Rodriguez, who recognized something in Harold's bearing that most civilians missed. Mrs. Patterson, the bakery lady, whose own father had come home from Korea, changed and quiet, never talking about what he'd seen but carrying it in his shoulders for 40 years until the day he died. None of them were saying much, but they weren't leaving either. Something fundamental had been violated here, some unspoken contract about how people were supposed to treat each other, especially people who'd earned the right to move slowly through the world with dignity intact. Slade looked around the growing circle of faces, his earlier confidence starting to crack. "This is ridiculous. You people don't know what you're dealing with." "We know what we saw," said the young mother, her voice quiet but firm. Back on the floor, Harold was trying to sit up. Lisa slipped her folded apron behind his head as a cushion, her fingers gentle against his graying hair. "Just stay still," she whispered. "Help is coming." Harold's eyes found hers, and he managed a small nod. Then his gaze drifted to his phone, which had spilled out of his shirt pocket when he fell. The screen was cracked, but it was still working. On the lock screen was a photo, a young Marine in dress blues, standing at attention, jaw square and eyes forward. His son. With careful movements, Harold reached for the phone. His thumb found the emergency contact, the one labeled simply Adam, base. One tap. Then he leaned back and closed his eyes. 700 miles away at Camp Pendleton, Staff Sergeant Adam Brenner was field stripping an M4 carbine when his phone buzzed against his thigh. Training had finished 20 minutes ago, and most of his Marines were heading to chow, but Adam had stayed behind to clean his weapon. Old habits. He glanced at the screen and froze. Text from Lisa Morales. She'd been taking care of his father for years. The kind of civilian who understood what service families needed without having to be asked. One word. Harold. That was all. Adam set down the rifle carefully, his movements suddenly precise, in a way that had nothing to do with regulation, and everything to do with the cold fire that had just ignited in his chest. "Something wrong, Staff Sergeant?" Lance Corporal Martinez asked, looking up from where he was packing his gear. Adam was already standing, already calculating distance and drive time. "Get the squad loaded. Full gear. We're rolling in 5. Where to?" Adam's voice carried the flat authority of a man who'd made harder decisions under worse circumstances. "Colorado. Someone put hands on my father." Martinez didn't ask for clarification, didn't question orders. He just started moving, and within 60 seconds, the word was spreading through the barracks like wildfire. Marines began emerging from doorways, gear in hand, faces set with the kind of quiet determination that came from years of brotherhood, forged in places where looking out for each other meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. They loaded into 3 Humvees with military efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary chatter. Sergeant First Class Williams took point in the lead vehicle, his navigation system already plotting the fastest route to Colorado. Lance Corporal Davis rode shotgun, monitoring radio traffic, and ensuring their convoy wouldn't be stopped by curious state troopers. In the back seats, Marines checked gear they didn't expect to need but brought anyway. A force of habit and men trained to prepare for everything while hoping for nothing. Adam filled out the dispatch paperwork with 4 words under mission objective. Family emergency. Immediate response. The duty officer who approved it had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood that some family emergencies required the full weight of the United States Marine Corps behind them. As the convoy pulled away from the base, kicking up dust clouds in the California desert, the only sound was the rumble of diesel engines and the whisper of tires on asphalt. No one spoke during the drive. They didn't need to. Back in Colorado, the grocery store had transformed from a quiet Tuesday morning into something that felt like a standoff. Slade was still trying to leave, but the circle of customers had closed tighter. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present. "This is insane," he said, looking from face to face. "You can't hold me here. I got rights." "So did he," said the off-duty cop, nodding toward Harold, who was now sitting upright against the cereal display with Lisa's help. Harold's breathing was steadier now, though his face was still pale. He looked up at the crowd that had formed around him, these ordinary people who'd chosen to stand between him and the man who'd hurt him. "Let him go," Harold said quietly. Everyone turned. "What?" Lisa asked. Harold's voice was stronger now, carrying the authority of someone who'd given orders under fire. "I said let him go. He's not worth this." Slade smirked. "See? Even Gramps knows when to quit." But the crowd didn't move. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery stepped forward, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, flour still dusting her apron. "We're not letting anyone walk away from this. Not when a man like you is lying on our floor." That's when they heard it. Low at first, mechanical, the deep rumble of heavy engines that didn't belong in a suburban parking lot. Everyone froze. Through the large windows at the front of the store, they could see dust clouds rising from the direction of the highway. Then shapes emerged through the haze, all of drab vehicles moving in formation, too precise to be civilian, too purposeful to be coincidence. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. The vehicles pulled into the parking lot with military precision, spacing themselves in a defensive perimeter that blocked all the exits. Humvees. Real ones, not the civilian knockoffs rich suburbanites drove to feel tough. Car doors opened in unison, and Marines began stepping out, not rushing, not shouting, just moving with the kind of coordinated purpose that made civilians step back without being told. Inside the store, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Slade turned toward the windows, his earlier bravado evaporating like steam. "This is some kind of joke, right?" But Harold wasn't laughing. He was smiling, a small, quiet smile that reached his eyes for the first time all morning. "He came," he whispered. The front doors of the grocery store slid open with their familiar pneumatic hiss, but the sound that followed wasn't familiar at all. It was the synchronized thud of combat boots on linoleum, precise and measured. Marines entered in pairs, their movements efficient and controlled. They didn't fan out like cops securing a crime scene. They didn't draw weapons or shout commands. They simply took positions that happened to cover every exit, every sightline, every possible avenue of escape. Their uniforms were immaculate, despite the long drive. Digital camouflage, crisp and clean, name tape straight, bootlaces tight. They looked like recruiting poster Marines, except for their eyes, which held the focused calm of men who'd seen real combat and weren't impressed by grocery store drama. The last Marine through the door was different. Older, broader through the shoulders, Staff Sergeant stripes on his sleeves and a name tape that read Brenner. Adam Brenner moved through the store like he owned it, but not in the swaggering way of a man trying to prove something. More like someone who'd calculated the tactical situation before he'd even stepped out of his vehicle and found it manageable. Kent Morrison, the store manager, rushed forward from the customer service desk, his face flushed and his hands fluttering nervously. Excuse me, you can't just, this is private property." Adam stopped and looked at him. Not glared, just looked. The kind of look that came from years of command, from making life and death decisions in places where hesitation got people killed. "My father's inside," Adam said, his voice conversational, but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute certainty. Kent stammered. We called the police. They're handling..." Adam walked past him like he wasn't there. The crowd of customers parted automatically, not from fear, but from some primitive recognition of authority. Adam moved through them with economical steps, his gaze scanning the scene until it locked onto the figure sitting against the aerial display. Harold looked up at his son, and something passed between them that needed no words. A communication built from 24 years of military service and 38 years of shared blood. Adam knelt beside his father, his uniform creaking slightly as his knee touched the floor. "Dad." "Took you long enough," Harold said. though his eyes were bright with something that might have been pride. Traffic was light. It was such a normal thing to say, so deliberately casual, that it almost broke the tension. Almost. Then Adam stood and turned toward Derek Slade. Slade had been watching the reunion with growing unease, his earlier confidence dissolving like sugar in rain. Now, faced with a United States Marine in full uniform, he seemed to shrink despite his size. "Look, I don't know what story the old man told you," Slade said, his voice higher than before, "but this is all some big misunderstanding." Adam didn't respond immediately. He studied Slade the way a scientist might study a particularly uninteresting specimen, taking in the nervous energy, the defensive posture, the way his eyes kept darting toward the exits that were now blocked by Marines. "You hit a veteran," Adam said finally, his voice so quiet that everyone in the store had to strain to hear it. "I hit some old guy who was in my way," Slade shot back, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "You hit my father." Adam's voice carried no anger, no threat, just fact, like he was reading coordinates from a map or reciting regulations from memory. But somehow that made it worse than if he'd been screaming. Slade tried to rally his bravado. "So what? You gonna court-martial me? This ain't a military base, soldier boy." Adam tilted his head slightly, considering this. "You're right, it's not." Then he turned to one of his Marines. "Corporal Williams." "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "Local authorities?" "ETA 6 minutes." Adam nodded and looked back at Slade. "We'll wait." For 6 minutes, nobody moved. Not the Marines, who stood at parade rest like they could wait all day. Not the customers, who seemed hypnotized by the surreal scene unfolding in their neighborhood grocery store. Not Slade, who was beginning to understand that he'd miscalculated badly. The only sounds were the hum of refrigeration units and the distant whisper of Muzak from overhead speakers. Even the store manager had stopped trying to regain control of the situation. When the police arrived, they moved with careful professionalism. The lead officer, Sergeant Patricia Valdez, was a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough to know when a situation was already under control. She looked at the Marines, at the customers, at the man sitting on the floor with his back against the cereal display, and at Derek Slade, who was now sweating despite the air conditioning. "Someone want to tell me what happened here?" she asked. 5 different voices started talking at once, but Adams cut through them all. "Assault on a disabled veteran. Multiple witnesses. Suspect's name is Derek Slade." Sergeant Valdez looked at Harold, taking in the cane, the careful way he was holding his ribs, the dignity in his posture despite everything. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" Harold shook his head. "Just bruised pride and a couple of ribs. I've had worse." She nodded and turned to Slade. "Mr. Slade, I'm placing you under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Slade's last act of defiance crumbled. "This is all bullshit," he muttered, but his voice carried no conviction. The Marines didn't cheer, didn't high-five, didn't even seem particularly satisfied. They just watched with professional detachment as Slade was led away, then began filing out of the store as quietly as they'd entered. Adam helped his father to his feet, supporting his weight without making it look like charity. Harold retrieved his cane and his dignity with equal care. As they walked toward the exit, Lisa approached with Harold's shopping basket, the bananas slightly bruised, but still salvageable. "Your groceries, Mr. B." Harold started to reach for his wallet, but Adam was already pulling out a 20. "Keep the change." "That's too much." "No," Adam said, looking around at the customers who'd stayed, who'd formed a wall of ordinary courage around his father. "It's not nearly enough." Outside, the Marines were already loading back into their vehicles. No fanfare, no speeches, just professional soldiers completing a mission and preparing to return to base. Harold paused at the passenger door of Adam's Humvee and looked back at the store. Through the windows, he could see people beginning to return to their shopping. But slowly, like they were still processing what they'd witnessed. "They didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Adam followed his gaze. Yes, they did. They just didn't know it until they had to. As the convoy pulled out of the parking lot, leaving nothing but dust and tire tracks, Harold settled back in his seat and closed his eyes. His ribs still ached, and tomorrow he'd have bruises that would take weeks to fade. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel invisible. The grocery store returned to normal, mostly. The next day, the cereal display was restocked, the floor mopped clean of any evidence. But there was a new awareness in the aisles, a different kind of attention paid to the older customers, especially those who moved with the particular careful dignity of men and women who'd served. Lisa kept a folding chair behind the customer service counter, not for any official reason, just in case. Mr. Brenner needed to sit down during his weekly shopping trips. She never asked if he wanted it. He never asked for it. But it was there, along with a small American flag pin she'd started wearing on her name tag, not because corporate required it, but because Tuesday mornings meant something different now. Carl Henderson, the retired steelworker who'd stood his ground, began arriving at the store the same time as Harold each week. Not following him, not making a show of it, just happening to need groceries at 7:15 on Tuesday mornings. Sometimes they'd nod. Sometimes they'd talk about the weather or the Broncos' chances this season. Mostly, they'd just move through the aisles with the companionable silence of men who'd both learned that some things didn't need words. Mrs. Patterson started bringing homemade cookies to work, keeping them behind the bakery counter in a clear container with a small sign, "Free for veterans. Thank you for your service." She never announced it, never made speeches, just put the container where people could see it, and trusted that word would spread the way good things do in small communities. And every Tuesday morning, when Harold pushed through the automatic doors with his careful stride and his black aluminum cane, people noticed. Not with pity or excessive gratitude, but with the quiet respect that comes from seeing someone's true measure when it matters most. The teenage stock boys would straighten up a little when they saw him. The cashiers would smile and mean it. Other customers would catch his eye and nod, the way people do when they've shared something important without planning to. Some Tuesdays, a Humvee would idle in the back corner of the parking lot for a few minutes before driving away. Harold never looked for it, but somehow he always knew when it was there. And in a town where nothing much ever happened, the story spread. Not as gossip or sensationalism, but as something else. A reminder, maybe. A measure of what ordinary people were capable of, when ordinary decency demanded it. Derek Slade served 90 days for assault, followed by community service at the VA hospital. The judge thought it might give him perspective. Whether it did or not, he was never seen at Thomas and Riley's Market again. But Harold still shopped there every Tuesday, moving through the aisles with his unhurried pace and his unassuming presence, still polite to the clerks, still careful with his money, still a man who'd learned long ago that real strength didn't need to announce itself. And if you'd asked him about that morning, about the scene with the Marines and the arrest, and the way a whole store full of strangers had chosen to stand up for an old soldier they barely knew, he would have said simply that people are generally good when they remember how to be. Then he would have picked up his groceries, thanked the cashier, and walked home. Because that's who he was, a man who understood that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought in grocery store aisles by ordinary people who decide that enough is enough. If this story moved you, if you believe that respect for our veterans shouldn't depend on whether anyone's watching, then do something for me. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that dignity isn't about age or strength. It's about character. And tell me in the comments, when was the last time you stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves? Because the truth is, we're all just one moment away from being Harold Brenner or Derek Slade. The choice is ours.